And we should be live. Just gonna double check. Are we live? And yes, we are. So this is the interview of my documentary. So the starting question is going to be, what first got you into HEMA?
What first got me into HEMA is, ironically, a lot of the same stuff that we're going to be talking about here, with, the idea of really cool, flashy combat is really appealing to someone, who doesn't necessarily know about how it all works, but is interested in history nonetheless. So being a historian and a fan of, portrayals of history, it was very interesting to me. It definitely gives me an insight of sorts into the exact intentions behind a scene, because what would be intended to be a very serious moment of action, when it's portrayed with less than a accurate technique, it makes it a lot more comical than it probably should be. Well, it's sort of the thing. I think that if it actually would be an aid to the movie, they'd probably include it. Because just in the sense that, someone experienced with fencing would be able to pick out, things wrong with it, with a particular scene. People that aren't versed in it don't necessarily notice those sort of things. And the flashy combat is a lot more entertaining to that audience than would be an actually experienced audience. It's sort of the reason why movies get more views than fencing matches. They're not necessarily the most interesting thing if someone is not invested in that field. Well, yeah, it's a similar idea in that it's all marketing. You've got to sell the film, and the really over the top stuff is going to be more appealing, because fencing matches themselves, to somebody who doesn't know much about it, there's not much action going on despite the nature of the sport. It's a very give and take, slow experience. Sometimes over in a matter of seconds, sometimes drawn out over, almost an hour. It really depends. And with that level of dynamic, it's not necessarily going to always fit.
True.
The arc that the story arc that a director needs, and it really allows for protagonists in particular to really get a focus in the film. Mm-hmm. Whereas because often the things that they're facing, it's like hordes of enemies, and if there were actually being realistic techniques employed, it probably wouldn't fit the feel that the directors are going for. There's always plenty of inaccuracies going on in the background too, but that's not where the focus is. So the audience is locked in with the protagonists, so they need to have an emphasis on their actions over any other participant in the film. So they're going to have much flashier moves, really broadcast their strikes, things like pirouettes, which all are just really bad ideas in actual combat, do make for a more entertaining scene. It comes up in just about any movie or TV series, usually involving swordplay. You'll have it. So one example would be the 300. Yeah, that's pretty much regarded as a classic, and the story of the 300 is fairly well portrayed, but some of the action sequences could definitely use some help. It's important to note about the 300 is the Spartan way of fighting is very shield centric. So a lot of flashy shield play is employed in that film. A lot of it being not necessarily what you would want to do. You can see the Spartans constantly throwing their shields to the side when issuing strikes or thrusts, which is not the point of a shield. You want to keep your shield interposed between you and your opponent, or else it doesn't provide any benefit. Moving it out of the way, but on the other hand, allows a better camera view of the person performing these actions. So it's understandable why, for the sake of cinematography, it's done. But I mean, it doesn't. I don't think it necessarily adds appeal to the scene visually. I think it sort of it even looks like it doesn't make sense. I think it's there strictly for the purpose of getting a better view of the protagonist or whoever is carrying out the strike. But realistically, they'd be leaving themselves wide open to attack. Yeah, that one's. I like that movie. It's easy to see some of the flaws, and especially when they have such a drawn-out one-on-one fight scene, like I was, just talking about. One-on-one fight scenes are really easy to see mistakes made. So I believe the first problem that comes around is we see, again, it's a sword and shield play, and Russell Crowe goes in for a thrust with his sword to the opponent, at which the opponent kind of reels back. That's a good reflex. And he has his axe ready above his head, and it's actually past Russell's guard. It's beyond the sword, and nowhere near Russell's shield as he's put it behind his own body in this lunge. Yet, instead of following through with an axe strike to the body where he's perfectly vulnerable, he simply uses the axe to parry the sword blow. That, in the fact that he's dual wielding, is utterly ridiculous, because he could simply parry the blow with his offhand, which is actually on the side where Russell is striking, and then simply finish him off, with an axe blow to the back of the head. Yeah, he does. This is a common movie thing of these sort of, simultaneous strikes when characters are holding two weapons. I suppose it could look visually appealing that they're both swinging at the same time, but it's utterly impractical. That's a huge mistake in swordplay. The whole advantage of even having two weapons is that you can parry with one and strike with the other.
Which would seem to be very, very out of place in an actual combat scenario. Oh yeah, in an actual combat, especially if your opponent only has one weapon in their hand. So in the scene, Russell does have a shield, but any strike that is parried could be immediately followed up by a second from the other weapon, and especially since the weapon in the left hand is an axe. It has a longer range than either of their swords, and therefore can hit before, in theory, strike the opponent before he can even get into striking range. Yeah, at least in scenes like this, where the combat exchanges are the primary focus. In a larger battle scene, it's somewhat more forgivable. I think in those instances, what's more important are realistic tactics. But in a one-on-one fight scene, I think that accurate representations of combat would increase my level of immersion in the film. Yeah, I think that the fact that they, let's say, for example, they did employ totally realistic combat, and then still kept, the comedic dialogue between the two characters. That actually might even seem more ridiculous, and I definitely think that even a non-experienced audience would be able to pick up that there was something wrong if the combat was so well choreographed, against uh, dialogue that just doesn't support that sort of approach to the film. So there's a couple of the exchanges where they do really classic movie combat stuff. I know that again we see a character dual wielding. So Will has two swords in his hand in the latter half of the fight, or in his hands, sorry, in the latter half of the fight, and he ends up in a edge bind with Jack, who only has one sword, and Will does this, not only does he do the classic "I'm going to strike with both swords," just like we saw in The Gladiator, but they remain there long enough to have witty dialogue, which I think it even contradicts the film itself, because I think earlier in that scene, Will says something about if he ever met a pirate, he would kill it, yet he's sitting here with two weapons, when really, to hold this bind, he would only need one. And he would have a perfect opportunity to strike with the offhand or main hand while these two are talking. But the less realistic combat is more of a priority in that instance, so you can get that character exchange. So the scene would not really be the same without it. If you had realistic combat, it would take away from what the scene was trying to do. I think it's all about, the context of the film. Of course, like I said, it's comical to somebody who knows what they're doing, but most people don't, and the more dramatized varieties are more entertaining to that audience, and that's going to be the larger audience, and that's ultimately what's going to be the market for the film. So it allows greater focus on the actions of the characters, and thus, things where you can insert bits about the plot, like they do during the fight between Jack and Will in Pirates of the Caribbean. It doesn't make the film laden with detail and doesn't distract from its actual intention. But, on the other hand, when things are done in a way that are realistic and entertaining, it's just that much better for everybody. Yeah, I don't know if comedy is ever the intent in fight scenes. Usually those are those are supposed to be action scenes. It's usually only comedic for somebody who's experienced. But in a comedic film, it's not. If the film is intended to be comedic, you don't necessarily need realistic combat. And if you don't have it, it's not like it's taking away from anything. But if a film is supposed to be, and if it is claiming to be historically accurate, that's going to draw a particular audience. And it's all about who the film is intended for. And if a film is making claims of historical accuracy, it's more likely to draw people who know about the events that are taking place in the film, and they might be able to see those sort of flaws.